I don't know how to describe it other than like a demon type of sound.
But it's silhouetted, hulking, every bit of 5.5 feet wide, 13 to 14 foot tall, pitch black.
The one thing that ran through my mind when I had this encounter was I don't have a big enough gun.
Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Welcome. This collection of stories is being brought to you by William Jevning and are being narrated by me, Jim Sower. These 7 stories come to us from California. Number 1. I am new to the Internet. I am new to the Internet, but have been interested in the existence of a large bipedal hominid in regions of the world since I saw one in 1970. At the time, my folks owned some property on the edge of the Round Valley Indian Reservation in Mendocino County, California. Their property overlooked the South Fork of the Eel River, affording an unobstructed view of the northern bank. While watching, through binoculars, a herd of about 15 wild hogs of various sizes, approximately a half-mile away, I noticed movement higher upslope, and focused in time to watch a man in what appeared to be a fur coat walk briskly across a meadow of about 40 yards in circumference. Now, 2 odd things immediately struck me. First, this occurred in early August around 4 p.m. The temperature was in the mid to high 90s, yet here was what happened to be a large man, maybe 6 feet tall, moving rapidly in the full light of the sun in a long, closely fitting fur coat. Second, I was quite familiar with the area, and knew that there was no road of any kind within 2 miles of that section of the Eel River. In addition, the terrain was quite steep and rough. My conclusion at the time was one of wonderment. I mentioned the man to friends and family, and over the next few years began to become acquainted with the Bigfoot, Sasquatch, ABSM, and the Alma, etc. phenomenon. Looking back, I am now convinced that what I saw was either a female Bigfoot or a young adult. I base this conclusion upon the fact that the size of the man I saw was not impressive. What was impressive was his ability to move over rough terrain with such ease and in the heat of an August afternoon. No one who is familiar with the trackless expanse of the American Northwest can have any doubt that unknown creatures could exist here. My opinion is that the more intelligent a creature, the more likely he is to remain less well known. But even with a higher intelligence, this creature has allowed itself to be observed. It is only a quirk of history that no hard evidence has fallen into the right hands at the right time. I believe that many pieces of hard evidence have been found, and through ignorance, have been stored in museums, collections, personal collections, or lost or destroyed. As I stated, I am new to the Internet, and so do not know proper procedures. I have included my own sighting here for the first time just because I have found this site interesting and as a way of showing support both for your continued efforts as well as for the continuance of open-mindedness. This concludes story number 1. Story number 2. Mendocino County, California. Mendocino County, California, September 2001, Hendy Woods State Park, Montgomery Woods. My girlfriend and I were camping along Highway 128 in Mendocino County, California. We stayed at an area called Hendy Woods. Highway 128 goes north-northwest from Cloverdale on US 101 to the coast near the Albion-Fort Bragg area, and Hendy Woods is in the redwood belt between Boonville and the coast. There are several stands of old-growth redwoods in the area. We decided to go to Montgomery Woods one morning, being told It was not a camping area and wouldn't have the motorhomes and kid-filled campsites, and the trees preserved there were spectacular. We arrived at Montgomery Woods about 8 a.m. and were going to hike the self-guided trail. The parking area is small, and it looked like we were the first, if not the only ones there. It was a cool, foggy September day. About 1/2 hour into the hike, my girlfriend thought she heard someone on the trail behind us. We stopped and waited, but there was no noise. We continued to the base of a huge redwood and sat to rest. The redwoods are an eerily quiet place, with the thick, soft redwood bark and ankle-deep tree leaves and needles absorbing lots of ambient sound. Suddenly we heard something moving through the underbrush 20 or 30 yards away from the canopy of trees. It was big, heavy, and moving at a good pace. I whistled, and the movement stopped. This was as scared as I've ever been. It was silent for a minute or so, then the movement continued. Whatever it was so close, and I was frustrated that I could only see brush moving, but not see the creature. It stopped moving about 100 feet or so away, then let out a scream that would scare the dead. We froze, thinking that this was it. From behind us, several hundred yards to the west, came a similar scream, as if responding to the first. We looked back, but couldn't tell where exactly it came from. Then the first creature screamed again, louder and longer than the first. I can't tell you how loud it was. The lung capacity was enormous. I can remember thinking that we might be surrounded, and that we might die there. Suddenly, the first creature started to move, not away, but parallel to the trail. There was a bit of a clearing, and we saw the left side of a 7-foot-tall, hair-covered biped. I've met Shaquille O'Neal at the L.A. airport, and this thing was so much bulkier. Huge through the chest and shoulders. I only saw the left arm, and the wrist was a diameter of my biceps. It looked at us for 2 or 3 seconds, then turned to its right and hustled down the ravine. We looked through the trees to follow its progress, but we had waited a minute or two, and it was gone. M.P. This concludes story number 2. Story number 3. Mount Shasta, California Encounter. I was an assistant caretaker with the Sierra Club Foundation at Horse Camp on Mount Shasta during the early 1990s. During the summer months, the regular caretaker, R.W., and I used to take turns staying at Horse Camp during the weekdays so as to police the place and offer assistance to potential climbers on their way up to the summit. During these off days, we usually saw very few people at Horse Camp, who would stay the night and climb the mountain the following morning. Normally, day hikers came up to visit and look around, but then went back down before sunset. It was a Thursday, and I was waiting for R.W. to come and relieve me so that I could go down to Shasta City to take a breather, get some food, find a shower. R.W. was typically late, so I decided to retire once I realized he wasn't going to show up. I don't remember what stage the moon was in, but a faint glow of light was present so that I didn't need to rely on my flashlight to get around. It was shortly before midnight, and I was in my tent, which I had set up less than 100 feet northeast of the horse camp hut. The area is a mix of stones and paths leading to other campsites and other trails to explore the mountain. After settling down for the night, I heard someone walk around the hut as stones clanked against one another. Knowing that R.W. was a big prankster, I yelled out his name a couple of times, but no response. Keep in mind, I spent a lot of time nights alone on Shasta, so I never had anything to worry about, which means that I was rarely fearful of anything. But when I got no response, I started to go off of pure instinct, and the chain of events became vivid. The walking sounds were getting closer to the left side of my tent, and thinking about how vulnerable I was, I grabbed my ice axe in my right hand and slipped out of my sleeping bag, poised to open the mosquito flap if anything was going to go down. My heart raced, and the adrenaline was pumping through me. Out of the left-hand side of the mosquito mesh door, I saw a huge outline of what I believed to be Bigfoot. The outline walked about 30 feet in front of my tent, stopped, turned, and stood facing me. At the time, I didn't think Bigfoot, but rather someone was up here to cause trouble. So I ripped open the door of the tent and jumped out with my ice axe in hand. I'm 6'3" tall, and this being was much bigger than I. We stood there for a few seconds, and the Bigfoot turned away and slowly walked into the trees. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep that night, but just because of the spiritual and peaceful nature of Mount Shasta, I didn't question my safety, and life went on as usual, with my only regret being that I showed this entity such hostility by brandishing my ice axe. In hindsight, I believe the being was just passing through and meant no harm. I looked for footprints the following morning, but only found an area where it looked like something had a difficult time getting up a steep incline. I didn't smell anything, since a small breeze was coming from behind me as we stood there face to face. I finished out the caretaking season without further incident, except for a group of thieving Boy Scouts from Sacramento. This is the end of story number 3. Story number 4. San Bernardino Mountains, Barton Flats. 1993, San Bernardino Mountains, Barton Flats Campground. This happened in the San Bernardino Mountains, California, at the Barton Flats Campground, which is southwest of Big Bear Lake, and I think it was off Highway 26. I was sleeping in my van, and 2 of my friends were sleeping in a tent about 15 feet away. I couldn't get to sleep, and I heard something walking around outside. I could hear snoring coming from the direction of the tent, and when I peeked out the window, I couldn't see anything. I started to get up, and all of a sudden, the van started rocking violently back and forth, and I was thrown from side to side. I yelled really loud, and the shaking stopped. My friends called from the tent and asked what the problem was, and at that point, I grabbed my flashlight and pulled back the curtains covering the back window and shined the flashlight outside. A figure moved towards the left, and I could see it was walking upright like a man, but it had hair from head to toe, and in a second, I saw it walk past the front windshield and head into the forest. I pulled open the side door and jumped out, yelling for my friends to get up. It smelled really bad, like a cesspool around our campsite, and I was badly shaken. We started a fire and started to talk about what had just happened, and I learned that something had been tossing pebbles onto the top of the tent, and they thought it was me, and then something had brushed up against the back of the tent. They also thought that was me. But after I told them about the van shaking, they swore it wasn't them, and we decided to pack up and head home early. Later, I remembered seeing a pair of yellowish eyes through the trees after we had first arrived, but they disappeared almost immediately, and I figured it was just a deer or something to that effect. I live in Redmond, Washington. I am currently seeking others in my area that might have an interest in Bigfoot, and I would like to participate in an organized search. I have already done a few searches on my own in the North Bend area, and I have spoken with some locals that swear they or someone they know has sighted Bigfoot. This is the end of story number 4. Story number 5. San Bernardino County, California. Glen Helen is in San Bernardino County on the way to Palmdale and Edwards Air Force Base. The landscape is desert scrub brush in a large canyon. No structures anywhere nearby. Nearest road with a name would be the I-15, about 10 to 12 miles distant. Nearest people would be the city of Devore, population 150, at about 15 miles. It was about this time of year, May. The sounds of Sasquatch? Here's an odd one for your files. About 1994, I was working as a medic at a dirt racetrack in Glen Helen, California. It was around 2 a.m. on a spring night. 5 of us were sitting on the bumper of an ambulance waiting for another unit to return so we could all go home. One of the 5 of us was seeing a female medic on the other unit, and we all waited together, talking about the day's events, venting. Adjacent to the parking area was a road construction staging yard full of graders, pipes, bulldozers, and big piles of sand and coarse gravel. This yard was fenced in chain link, with those white strips of plastic woven into it so you can't see the inside. We'd been sitting there for about 10 minutes when I heard what sounded like footsteps. Now, normally this would have meant nothing to me except that we were miles from any habitation in the high desert. Nobody would be passing through there. I heard what sounded like heavy footfalls in the gravel just on the other side of the fence, maybe 20 feet from us. I didn't want my friends to think I was a kook, so I listened without saying anything until the faces of my friends all reflected the fact that they had heard it too. They stopped chatting, and we all listened. Heel, toe, crunch, crunch. This was spooky not because we were out in the middle of nowhere at night, unarmed, but because we were medics and liked to think we had seen and heard everything there is. This was new. The sound was of a heavy biped strolling around in the construction yard near the fence. And I do mean strolling. Desert night air carries sound very well, so I was 100% sure this was not a deer, rabbit, or any other 4-legged animal. One of us started to yell something like, "Hey, who are you?" No response. After a brief pause, continued footsteps. Heel, toe. Well, being young and male, we decided to meet our visitor in person. We started our one ambulance and pointed its high beams and utility spotlight towards the construction yard gate. It was unlocked, so we opened it wide. The only self-defense we could find were 2 tire irons, so we were 3 people armed only with the tire irons and went ahead, with 2 female medics standing back by the unit. The yard was full of equipment and shadows, lots of shadows. We walked about 30 feet inside with nothing hairy in sight. Those shadows, though, were getting much closer to us with every step we took, so we decided to retreat with honor. Whatever made those sounds, that yard was his territory, not ours. We backed out and closed the gate. The sounds continued shortly after, but fainter, from the far side of the yard. We stood in the headlight glow until the second unit showed. We turned off the oxygen tanks and set the extra battery switch to off so we could all depart for our homes in our personal vehicles. When we told our story to the other crew, they laughed until they saw we weren't laughing along. "No joke, guys, listen." They wisely chose not to listen, but to hit the road with the rest of us. Now, I know that you might say it was a bum or an animal. I don't think so. When I walked in there and stepped on the same gravel, I couldn't make the same crunching sounds, and I weigh 175 pounds. Sasquatch? What would he drink out there, or eat? Where would he hide in the daytime when it's over 110 degrees Fahrenheit? I have no idea. I do know none of us ever accepted a night shift out there again. Fool me once. That's the end of story number 5. Story number 6, San Diego County, Julian, California. Virginia Louise Swanson, a retired veterinarian, spoke openly with friends and Bigfoot researchers many times by phone. She was a very sharp woman. Given her age and mental acuity, she was 90, she was still bright and right on the money with mental tasking and physical abilities. Just before she died, she was driving a bulldozer in an effort to plow a road to her new house. She even prospected for gold in her spare time. The following story is her account of the Bigfoot creatures seen in the back country of San Diego County, California. While her story appears incomplete, it should be of interest to San Diegans, if not Southern Californians. My book, Night Sight of Gold, was written from hindsight remembrance of encounters with Bigfoot during an 8-year mining venture in the Santa Lucias along the coast of Southern California. Now, in the lagunas around Julian in San Diego County, I have been actively pursuing reports of Bigfoot in these mountains and the Anza Borrego Desert below, and most particularly within a certain Indian reservation. In February 1981, I happened to be at the right place at the right time to meet a young Indian who talked openly of his interest in Bigfoot and said he had seen him on his reservation and knew the location of caves where Bigfoot hid, and he would take me there, now. He guided me up a fearfully storm-wrecked road. My ancient van was not designed for such, nor my senior years to cope, but once started, there was no turning back. Disaster seemed certain, but I would die trying. We reached a small flat. "Park here," my escort said. "Now we hike down a canyon." He hiked ahead rapidly, and I eventually caught up with him, napping under a bush. Below him, a small stream followed a darkened canyon around a bend. I had parked in bright sunlight, and in less than a mile we had descended into sunless gloom. "The caves are over there, but I am not about to go there." Until my guide refused to enter a taboo area, I had not really believed his story. I knew that no money or incentive on earth will induce an Indian to enter taboo ground. "Okay, now we wait." "Have a seat," I said to him. "What are we waiting for?" He said, "To watch. He comes out this time of day and walks around. He drinks from those old rock troughs I showed you by the road. Sometimes he hangs out by that wrecked house where the road loop starts. You in a hurry?" I told him no, but that I was not about to drive back down the road in the dark. We hiked back down to my van, which was completely concealed in the brush until you reached the road. It was dusk when I drove out of the reservation. After a week of heavy storms had eased up, I sought out my Indian escort. But unlike before, he was neither friendly nor talkative. Briefly, I was then told, "My people are complaining. Our tribal spokesman is very displeased. You will not be welcome to return, with or without your friends, and trespassers risk being shot." So I backed down for a while, but I was not out. For 3 months I planned for a return trip. A friend obtained permission from a well-known Indian to drive up the mountain just to take pictures, to stay on the road and not to wander around the reservation. I had studied the map well, but a certain hunch compelled me to request we reverse our direction. After a steep turn, we were blocked, but good, by a heavy pickup in the road next to a parked bulldozer. In front stood 5 Indians, shoulder to shoulder, spanning the road, with their backs to us. "Looks like we've got trouble," my escort said very quietly. He stepped out with a cheery greeting, and, as a Forest Service firefighter, was recognized. 2 men approached me. "You see Bigfoot this morning?" They knew who I was. "No? Oh, I came up here just to shake hands with him." That brought welcomed laughter, then a statement. "I have seen him. He comes up from the canyon below the flat you just passed. He doesn't come out very often." Well, this confirmed what my first Indian guide had told me. The sticky situation was smoothed out, but not to the extent that we could continue to explore. I am presently biding my time for the right moment to return. Note: it is believed that Virginia Louise did make it back to the area several times before she moved to her late husband's mining claim in Central California. She died not long after her move. In all subsequent instances, her efforts in the lagunas were stymied by the local Native Americans. Her book, The Night Side of Gold, is out of print. Perhaps she published it herself to give copies to interested people. P.T.R. This ends the 6th story. Story number 7. Sierra National Forest, California, 1963. I was deer hunting with a party of relatives in the south end of the Sierra National Forest in the fall of 1963. I would have to look up on old maps to determine a more exact location, but I remember that we had gone to this particular spot because it was as far into the woods as our 2-wheel vehicles would take us, and where a long jeep trail into the wilderness began. We had traveled most of the wee hours of the night to get to the spot. Before daylight, we split up and entered the woods to try to establish stands for the day's hunt. I reached a likely spot at about daybreak and settled down to wait. I had fallen timber concealing me in every direction, and yet enough open lanes of sight that I felt that I could see any animal or hunter that might approach. I had a bottle of buck scent, which I sprinkled liberally on the bushes and my clothing to cover my scent. It worked well. 2 deer with spikes, about 12 inches long, came down the slope toward me and stopped about 1 foot off the end of my gun barrel. Their nearness made me nervous. I rose to one knee and tried to shoo them away. All they did was stomp the ground and snort at me. I could not shoot them legally, so I had to get rid of them. Finally, I carefully rose to my full height, waved my arms, and shouted at them, and they left. An hour or so later, another deer approached from my left and stood behind a fallen log and stared at me for the space of perhaps 10 minutes before it finally turned and bounded into the woods. A couple of hours passed, and nothing further happened to break the stillness. The flies and bees droned. The sun got warmer, and I got sleepier. Having gotten little sleep the night before, I decided to stretch out and take a short nap. In moments, I was sawing logs. I don't know how long I slept, but I awoke with the odd sensation that I was being observed. Expecting to sit up and see yet another curious yearling scoping me out, I carefully sat up with my gun in my hands and looked around. There, in front of me, and not over 10 feet away, was an individual of considerable bulk and stature, rapidly striding silently away from me at an angle. I say individual, as at that moment I thought another hunter had discovered me asleep, and I felt rather foolish about it. Nevertheless, I called out to the other hunter to ask him if he had seen anything, and to perhaps impress him with my earlier sightings that might vindicate my hunting sleeping technique. He made no response whatsoever, and vanished into the forest so completely and quickly that I could not hear his progress away from me, or see him when I had risen to my feet a moment later. What I had seen was a creature covered with grayish-black hair, whose head had a pointed quality toward the rear, not rounded as a man's would have. It was not as pointed in configuration as a hooded jacket or sweater might have been, and it was not made of material, but rather fur or hair. Also, I could not distinguish facial contours of skin tones as one would expect to see at the edge of a hood. Any skin about the face was the same color as the fur covering the head. The creature was only visible to me from about the waist upwards, as logs obscured my view of him below that. He had the appearance of muscular bulk, like one would expect to see at Muscle Beach, and his height had to have been at least 6 foot 6 inches tall. His stealth in the woods was remarkable. The ground everywhere about that area was covered with branches and debris from the fallen trees, but he made no sound, and moved very deliberately and rapidly away from me, with no regard for my hail. I cannot imagine another hunter looking like that, or disregarding my call in the midst of the perfectly quiet woods. When I later saw Roger Patterson's film footage, I was struck by the similarities between my sighting and what he captured on film. Jack Graham. This concludes the reading of the 7 stories. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.